Technology is wonderful, except when it's not. Before we get into our message, which is bitter waters, I want to share with you something that I found a few years back, and it kind of impressed me because most of you, like me, I suspect, have grown up watching the movie Exodus, where Charlton Heston led all the Israelites out of Israel and across the Red Sea. And while that's a beautiful movie, it's not very accurate. No. So what we want to look at is what the logistics were for some of those people in Israel at that time. When Moses set out into the desert, he was feeding 2 to 3 million people, which requires a lot of food. Those people needed 2,000 tons for 4 million pounds of food each day. To bring that much food each day would require 3 freight trains, each a mile long. In the desert, they needed firewood to cook and keep warm. Each day, they would take 4,000 tons, or 8 million pounds, of wood, and a few more freight trains, each a mile long. And of course, they needed water, which is our subject today. If they only had enough water to drink and wash a few dishes, it would take 11 million gallons of water each day. And a freight train with tank cars, 1,800 miles long, just to bring water. And then there's another thing. When they went across the sea of reeds in one night, had they gone double file like Charlton Heston, the line would have been 800 miles long and required 35 days and nights to get through. To do it in one night as they had to walk 5,000 abreast, which is a gap almost 3 miles wide. When they camped each day, they would need a campground 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island, about 750 miles. That is just a little bit of a picture of what it took to get the people of Israel through the desert. So when we look at the suffering that they dealt with, it might be easy to look at them and kind of judge them and say, hey, these people are being a little bit grumbly and complaining. But I think if we're noticing it, that most people will tend to be that way at times. Anybody that's ever had discomfort or had to suffer generally will react in a way that's not very pleasant. We grumble, we complain. And Exodus 15, 22 through 26 takes place only 3 days after they've crossed the Red Sea. Now, mind you, they have just witnessed all of the plagues of Israel. They have witnessed the Red Sea crossed and the Egyptians killed in the sea. And this is 3 days later. Things are getting a little tough. It says, Then Moses made Israel and set out for the Red Sea. And they went into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? And he cried out to the Lord and showed him a log. And he threw that log into the water, and it became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule. There he had tested them, saying, If you will diligently listen to my voice of the Lord your God, and do which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases of you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. Now, as I said, this is only 3 days after crossing through the sea. I've heard a lot of folks tell me that if they could have witnessed the miracles they saw in the Old Testament, they wouldn't have as much problem with their faith. They would have a lot easier time trusting God. But here we are just 3 days, and the Israelites seem to have just that sort of problem. Now, to be fair, where they're at is a dry and barren land. There are 3 days wandering, and they probably carried water, but as it says there, they're going to need some 11,000 gallons a day just for the basics. It wouldn't take long for whatever you had to run out. And I suspect by that 3rd day, the Israelites had run out of water. And then on the horizon They sense there is water, and they rush over, thankful that there's water, but it's no good. It's a problem. They can't drink it, nor can their animals. And I think, to be fair, when you look at that, we can easily judge them because we're sitting here in a comfortable church with water aplenty, and we're going to be very easily satisfied if we need the water. But when you have women and children and animals that are suffering because they have no water, it is easy to get where you trust God a little less than you should. It is kind of a thing that I wonder if God's test here was not so much that they were going to be without water for a period, but that they were going to have to deal with the hopes being put up by seeing the water, only to find that water being bitter. You know, too often, when I look for problems, I look for easy solutions. If I'm thirsty, I go to my faucet and I drink. And you know, that works. But what if it doesn't? What happens when what I expect to solve my problems doesn't solve my problems? The Israelites are in just that sort of position. They have found water 3 days into the desert, but then they find that water undrinkable. It is true that we as human beings do not like to suffer. We don't like discomfort. We fail to take life's hardships easily. One of the things that I see as a sign of that is the opiate epidemic we have today, where if I have the slightest pain, I want a doctor to give me a pill so that I don't have to suffer at all. I don't want to feel any discomfort. And in a way, we've become very spoiled. And I suggest to you that that's nothing new. Mankind has been that way for quite some time. Now, for Israel, their life of being free of problems and suffering was not to be. What they did not know was they are about to embark on a 40-year journey in the desert. They're going to spend a lot of time looking for water, wishing they had just a little bit more. Now, part of that 40-year period is because they weren't listening to God. They were not doing what God asked them to do, which was to follow their covenant. We do not take God as our vending machine, if you would. We do need to understand that it is not a life that we're going to have which is free.
Yes, I'm okay.
When they look at the way they are living, when you look at the way that they're doing in 40 years, we are not.
Please, I want to question. Please, 6 feet away.
Mike, just relax and, yeah. Mikey, you're going to have to settle down and be quiet or else go in the other room, please.
I'm sorry, I'm under quarantine. But
Yeah.
that is not transmitted.
Okay. If you want to, just go in the other room if you feel like you need to move around. Okay. So what God is telling the Israelites is that they are supposed to follow Him. They're supposed to trust Him. The words there that says, the Lord has made them a statute or rule, and there He tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to my voice and the Lord your God, and do what is right in His eyes, give ear to His commandments, and keep all His statutes, I will put none of those diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your God. That's a promise by God. It, by the way, does not notice that He says you'll never have to suffer. It does not say you will not get thirsty. It does not mean that it will never feel want. The problem is, the Israelites did not heed that advice, and I will tell you that it's real easy to sit here some few thousand years later and judge them, but then realize how quickly I follow their same example. You know, the truth of it is, life goes by and mostly a blur. And it's very rare that I find myself looking at the world through a godly point of view. Often, there are things in my life that I find quite inconvenient and sometimes problematic. When I get ill, when I've got someplace to be and I have a flat tire, or my vehicle won't start at all, or a million of other problems that you and I will face in this world every day because we are not willing to be able to trust God to get us through those. There are people today that will try to tell you that to be a Christian means no more suffering. There are some very, very famous preachers, by the way, making great deals of money, who will tell you that if you believe and trust in God, life gets gravy. You just won't have any problems. You won't have any difficulties. Now, that's all kind of fun to hear, except it has nothing to do with what the Bible tells me. In fact, Jesus' own words, John 16:33, says, I have said these things to you that you may have peace. In this world, you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome this world. What Jesus is saying is, I can give you a peace that when things go wrong, and he says, and they will. You've all heard of Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. Back when I was a cop, I used to call something called Baki's Law. They used to call me Baki. And Baki's Law was, if anything can go wrong, it already has, I just don't know it yet. And that's a pretty cynical and satirical look at life. But there's not, I want to say, too much that's wrong about that. In this world, you will have tribulation. That's what Jesus said. However, he also says, I'm leaving you a peace. And do not be overwhelmed because I have overcome this world. Whatever you deal with, whatever you have done in your life, God is bigger than that. We have, like the Israelites, often failed our tests when we come against troubles and problems and grumbled and complained. And I think too often we look at that and we say, well, I have a right to be upset. I have a right to feel upset with God because, man, what's going on in my life isn't fair. I shouldn't have to face cancer. I shouldn't have to deal with the loss of a loved one. And it reminds me of a bit of a story of a man who was shipwrecked and he lost everything. And when he was on the island, he spent a lot of time trying to get himself better. And he took and he built a hut and he did all sorts of things and he brought up food and he did everything he could do. And one day while he was out scavenging for more food, his little hut and all his food supply and all of his belongings burnt to the ground. He comes back to his hut in ashes. Everything he'd worked so hard for. His supper was burnt. He could not eat it. And he sat on the floor of that burnt-out hut and he says, God, how could you do this to me? He was grumbling. He was complaining. But the next morning, he was surprised to be awakened by the sound of a ship pulling in to the island. And when the people came to rescue him, he says, how did you know I was here? And they said, we saw your smoke signals. The very thing that he saw was God punishing him, was God delivering him. We saw your smoke signal. Had his hut not burnt to the ground, that ship would have passed him by, never knowing he was there. He lived a life of subsistence. These Israelites are in a desert. They got just enough food, just enough water to survive. They did not have extra food for all the things they would like to have. It was a tough life. And when life gets tough, you know, we tend to want to complain. We want to try and make it easier. It reminds me of a bit of a story of a man watching an egg hatch. And as he's watching this chick within the egg struggle to peck its way out of its eggshell, It took an awful long time, and at times it seemed like the chick was giving up, and the man started to be moved with pity. And so he decided to help this chick out. And so he basically took and chipped away at the eggshell for this chick to be free. And feeling pretty good about himself until just a few hours later when the chick died. And when he talked to someone who knew a little more about them than he did, they explained to him, the struggle of the chick getting out of the egg was what gave that chick strength to live. By taking away that struggle, he had removed that chick's ability to live. He had literally taken the chick's life by trying to ease its pain. I would suggest to you that we are in that kind of a situation. God allows tribulation in our lives. There will be trouble in your life. Make no mistake about that. God promises it. Tribulation is coming. But do not be overwhelmed by that tribulation, because I have overcome this world. And a peace that he gives us will allow us to take that. Now, I will tell you that oftentimes when I read verses like this, I have a bad habit of looking at other people and going, well, they had it easier than me. When I read about these Israelites, sitting at my desk writing this message, I had a jug of water at my desk. These Israelites were 3 days in the wilderness. I have very little doubt that during that third day, every drop of water they had disappeared. They were without water. Their kids were hungry, their animals were hungry, they were hungry and thirsty. They did not know what was going to happen. Then, when all hope seemed but lost, what happened? Water appeared. Now, like you and me, I'm sure they were elated until they got there and found that water bitter. That bitter water was a test. It was a way of preparing these Israelites for the trials that were going to come. I will suggest to you that we also will face bitter waters. There will be hard times in your life that you're going to face, and you're going to go, okay, the doctors have told me this will help, only to find out it doesn't. Or they're going to say this is going to work for this, and it's not. Those are bitter waters, because what we did was we put our hopes in something other than ourselves and God. We have literally taken God out of our equation. We trust in what we see instead of what we cannot see, which is God. You will face bitter waters in your life. If you haven't already, trust me, they're coming. The Bible is meant to prepare me for that. It is meant to show me how the Israelites responded. Now, what it says is they grumbled. Now, again, I can't be too judgmental, because I can tell you of a few times in my life where I have grumbled against God. There have been more than once where I said, Lord, this isn't fair. This isn't right. I want something different than what I'm getting. The truth is, the bitter waters of this world force us to rely on God. It forces us to turn to, and I will tell you this, Exodus 15 was just the preview of what the Israelites were going to face for the next 40 years. And if you study that book of Exodus and you see how they respond, it's unfortunate, but they don't do very well. And oftentimes they are chastised, both by Moses and by God, because of their lack of faith, their lack of trust, their unwillingness to be able to place themselves in God's hands. If Israel was condemned for that, then I should have no delusion that God feels the same way about me today. I do have a choice today. And the choice, I believe, comes from reading the Bible and seeing how others have faced their battles. When the Israelites faced bitter water, they grumbled and they complained because they didn't trust God, and God was not pleased with them. And he reminded them, in fact, that they were to keep their commandments, that they were to continue to trust in God and not life. Because, as God said, in this world you will have tribulation. Life is hard. I assure you that if you're not going through a time of bitter waters are coming. There will be a time where you are caused to consider and question what God is doing in your life. Because to be honest, that's our life. You will have hard times. Now, how I face those hard times will be a determination of just how long. Israel did not do a very good job. And I will warn you that Israel spent 40 years going through a desert that logistically, if they had gone straight across, they could have done in 2.5 months. The Israelites caused themselves needless pain and discomfort because of their refusal to trust God. In your and my life today, we too can cause ourselves needless pain and suffering because we refuse to trust God. The difference between 2.5 months and 40 years is extreme. But it is what it'll take if we are not willing to listen to God, if we're not willing to follow the biblical examples that He has given us. So I would suggest to you that we need to look at our Bibles more and more to understand just how badly things have gone in the past and how in times before God has allowed people to take their own suffering and increase it because of their lack of faith, their lack of trust. We can do that to ourselves. Not because God is a judgmental God that's going to knock us upside the head when we act wrong. It's because God gives us the freedom to either choose to follow Him and trust Him or to grumble and complain and not trust Him. Trusting God is the key. And trusting God is the key to a peace-loving world that is not controlled by this world. When you face bitter waters, and trust me, you will, you have a choice. Will I trust God through this, or will I be challenged and grumble and complain like the Israelites? And that is the time that we must realize, just like the Israelites, we are making choices. We are taking sides. The difference between 2.5 months and 40 years of suffering relies in ourselves. We get to make the choice. What will that choice be? Thank you.